That's all I need to play for most of you to know what this is. If not, simply search up Grubhub ad on YouTube and you'll have all the context you need. Recently, this ad has been made the internet's laughingstock for the past couple of weeks, and for good reason. By virtually every angle, this is a pretty terrible advertisement. The music is ear-grating, the characters writhe around in unsettling ways, the attempts at humor are pathetic, and when I first watched it, by the time it was over, I hardly even understood what they were trying to sell me. A vast majority of the ad is taken up with characters dancing with food. How does that communicate to me what your service actually does? How do Grubhub perks work? Instead of giving useful information in the little time they have, they fill it with nonsense. All I know is that good deals make these characters boogie. What struck me is that I almost thought I had seen this advertisement before, and when I searched my thoughts, I realized I practically had. I had seen the Kroger ad beforehand, with almost the exact same premise. Although I will say that the Kroger ad seems to have outperformed the Grubhub ad in music choice and acceptance of criticism. Among the faults of both of these cringeworthy ads is their generic and cheap-looking art styles, and this is what interested me. I think the low quality of Grubhub's art style in particular can be demonstrated quite effectively with how the child's eyes look like they are about to pop out of his Play-Doh head, and when the milkshake lady passes by the camera and you can see her jagged eyelids and mouth that looks like it was formed by cutting into her face with scissors. But even if things like this were more polished, the art style you are still left with is reminiscent of many others, isn't it? These kinds of bubbly, overly smooth, noodle-limb people have become commonplace in 3D animation, especially in advertising and more utilitarian assets. It's fair to say that the wonder of this style of 3D has worn off on me. Cleanly textured, soft and squishy looking models have become generic. I've seen it all before. So much so that I sometimes find myself mesmerized by videos of early computer graphics where the limited rendering capabilities are obvious. I find there is a kind of nostalgic charm to them. Its primitive attempts are a novelty, a relic of a bygone technological era. In no way do I mean to imply this generalized squishy style is always bad. It can clearly be used with purpose, and an otherwise unremarkable style can be elevated by superior animation and character design. But there's undeniably an element of oversaturation and mass appeal, which is not always bad either, but it can explain why to some, including me, it can feel fake, kind of factory produced. The only animated ad I can even remember in recent memory besides this new wave of rightfully mocked commercials is the Sprite Cranberry one, which stood out to me solely because of the tinge of creepiness from stop-motion LeBron James. However, it could be stop-motion, or it could be CGI simulated stop-motion, I genuinely can't tell, although I'm leaning toward the latter. The work of animators like WorthaKids has completely expanded my idea of what's possible with 3D. Even that brief stylistic change was enough to leave a mark on my brain, and of course memes probably had a helping hand. I doubt I'm going to be forgetting the Grubhub ads anytime soon now. Yes, ads. There's at least 2 more of these things, and wait a minute. There's lore? There's Grubhub lore?
The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be.
You will never catch me equating this with the clear care and effort of the animation of, say, Pixar or a student film. However, I think you'll agree that with the increasing availability and power of 3D software, mainstream 3D animation in general has become more and more of an imitation of the kinds of things Pixar and Disney are capable of, bordering on replication. As a result, through no fault of the artists in their fields, things have seemed to become more generic. It's a simple case that if audiences see a lot of similar things, these things begin to lose their novelty, and they begin to notice the repetition. When something really different comes along, it's almost surprising that 3D can be used for something else besides extreme realism or illumination-type mushiness. A similar story can be seen in 2D illustration as well, especially for large businesses. This flat, drastically simplified art style with sharp shapes that look like they were laser cut from construction paper has become so commonplace that people have started to notice its presence, and subsequently criticize it. This vector-based, minimalist art style does not have an official, all-encompassing name. The style specifically developed for Facebook is called Alegria. Spanish for joy. But you might as well apply that name to all these kinds of styles, because to the average viewer they might as well be from the same family. Many have begun to criticize its constant use. One person even made this amusing parody image. I at least understand the underlying cynicism. This art style has over the years become synonymous with big tech companies such as Google, Facebook, and YouTube, businesses that have become worryingly more and more prominent in our daily lives and in our politics. And if we have even a little bit of concern for the health of our society, we should all be scrutinizing regularly. It can feel fake. Like faceless corporations are trying to distract you with primary colored skinned people and almost infantile basic shapes and utopian scenes. But on the other hand, it's hard to find any technical fault with the style. It usually isn't badly designed, nor does it lack readability. It has all the efficient simplicity one expects from modern graphic design. It would be unfair to lump all styles with simple shapes and bright colors into this corporate art style category. There are indeed differences between them in use of proportion, texture, and the handful of details. But unfortunately, as much as these differences exist, as much as these illustrators try to be inventive when they can, as the average person glances over these styles, a kind of homogenization takes place. They really do look very similar, and messing around with a few color choices or changing up proportions can't really change that. The main reason I've become disillusioned with this art style over the years is the same as why I've become disillusioned with modern 3D. It has become painfully generic. The prevailing art styles of the past all have one thing in common. They were in some way influenced by the circumstances of their times. The biggest influencer of today has to be our technology. Digital illustration tools are available to practically everyone, and they are relatively easy to use. Nowadays, one does not necessarily have to learn drawing fundamentals to become a graphic designer. I can draw pretty good circles in one stroke. A compass can produce a nearly perfect circle with practice, but Photoshop or Illustrator can produce a perfect circle with a few clicks. In the digital workspace, anything can be undone, anything can be saved. Large amounts of iterations can be produced quickly. The simplicity of this style means it can be standardized and replicated. But by far, the most important reason for the prominence of this vector-based style is one that you hear all too often. It's cheaper. When illustrators get paid less and are expected to produce more, they have to take shortcuts. Quick keyboard clacking tips and tricks that can produce an image the hour your employer wants it. Let me make this clear. By no means do I intend to belittle the individual illustrators who work in this style. The simple reality is that when you need to meet a deadline, illustrating using flat shapes and limited color palettes in general requires less work than fully fledged detailed illustrations. This kind of style is by no means new. Graphic design has been on a simplified geometric route for quite a while. It has its roots in modernism, with schools like the Bauhaus that influence basically everything about graphic design you see today. And I can draw from this style a few parallels to a certain designer from the early 1900s I hold in high regard. In surface elements, the poster art of A.M. Cassandra and the big tech art style is similar. Flat shapes, simplified icons, limited colors, but in substance, they are vastly different. Cassandra put a lot of stock into the organization of elements to create his own visual language, paying careful attention to alignment and rhythm, using modular grids and combining basic shapes to produce representations, often delving into mathematical obsession with proportion. You would think this would make things look stiff, but through his talent, Cassandra could obtain expressiveness, spirit, and above all else, visual interest. His posters of ships and trains especially are favorites of mine. Sure, my appreciation for them stems somewhat from the mythos of luxury transportation and Art Deco of the 1920s and 30s, but that perception of industrial might is also conveyed just by design. The vehicles are seen in a worm's eye view. The cruise liners and trains are allowed to overwhelm you with monolithic black shapes. A famous poster of a ship called L'Atlantique uses just a single large rectangle in the center of the composition to stylistically form one side of the cruise ship, making it tower over the ocean and the tugboat like a skyscraper floating on the water. It might be the most clever use of a single rectangle I've ever seen. I am especially struck by how clean and modern they look even today. Even almost 100 years later, they still have their power. A.M. Cassandra didn't have Photoshop or Illustrator, though I do wonder what he could have produced with those tools. He had stencils, rulers, pencils, paper, paint. He didn't use basic shapes and grids because that's what computers were efficient at making. He did it because that was the style he wanted to work in. I'm sure that the advantages of not having to labor over fully detailed forms was apparent to him, although he did plenty of that as well. But he did not work in this style solely because it was cheaper or required less work. These posters are works of art. They are meticulously planned and endlessly innovative. They are about as close to graphic design perfection as you can get. And while Cassandra is my favorite, similar things could be said about other Art Deco minimalist posters around the same time. Simply put, the Alegria style, and others like it, is used to appeal to as many people as possible as easily as possible. Ironically, appealing to potentially less people who see through its act. These illustrations use minimalism to do a lot with very little, while these use minimalism to avoid doing a lot. And while I expect that from corporations who often bend to the whims of playing it safe and appealing to the general public, I find it odd that this stock look even persists in magazines, where you would expect a degree of artistic freedom. The work of A.M. Cassandra pops into my mind frequently, even a year after discovering him. The same cannot be said about last week's New Yorker cover, or whatever illustration YouTube chooses to pair with its next website-destroying policy update. That's not to say this vector trend is something that really bothers me. It feels more like a brief rut in graphic history, from which new and exciting styles will come forth. I'm sure in time, the great will separate itself from the quick and passable. But I think there's something to be said about the recent sameness of modern vector-based illustration, and I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for something better. If big tech, editorials, and websites want to appeal to me through their illustrations, there's one big thing they can do. Actually pay your illustrators! It's really quite amazing that even in our continually animated and illustrated world, artists' work is still sometimes treated like a silly hobby that doesn't deserve the same compensation compared to other jobs. Artists are still regularly asked to work for free. Artists most likely had a hand in every piece of media you've ever consumed. They are incredibly necessary for your magazine, your video, your website, and without illustration, you miss a major part of communication with your audience. You get what you pay for. And if you pay your illustrators and give them more time, you're going to get better illustrations, greater innovation, and greater creativity. Maybe then it won't be seen as the corporate art style, but rather the cool art style, I guess. I don't know how to end this video. Big businesses, start investing more in your workers. They're one of the big reasons you exist.